Thank you for being here. Today we're having an important but sadly neglected topic, which is how our cities really function. We tend to think that cities operate through master plans and there's a system of governance, but we don't realize that perhaps a majority of the city survives outside the framework of master planning. And we have an in-depth study as the basis for our discussion today by Sushmita Pathi, which looks at two villages in Delhi which got absorbed into the city. And because they had pre-urban origins and could not be subjected to planning because they had a built form that pre-existed the planning of the city, they developed land markets and systems of tenure and rent negotiations which are completely outside the system. And actually that's to understand how that works, I think is very crucial if you really got to get a handle on how Indian cities work. Sushmita Pathi, who's the author of the book, is an assistant professor at National Law School of India University. She did a PhD in political science at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And her research interest lies at the confluence of urban politics and political economy. And she's published in EPW, Indian Sociology, as well as media outlets like Wire and India Forum. Our other speakers, she's joined by Carol Upadhyay, who's a social anthropologist and visiting professor in the School of Social Sciences at the National Institute of Advanced Studies at Bangalore, India, where she's been researching, writing, and also leading a lot of very important discussions on the city. And we have Matthew Idikula, who comes from a background in law, but works also in policy research. And he's a legal and policy consultant based in Bangalore and a visiting faculty at Azim Premji University. He's also a consultant with WIEGO, the Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing, and the Center for Law and Policy Research. And his research focuses on issues concerning cities, local governance, and federalism. Our discussion is moderated by Atreya Majumdar, who's an anthropologist who teaches at National Law School of India University and has published a book, Space and Capital in India, Longing and Belonging in an Urban Industrial Hinterland, which was published by Routledge in 2018. She's also a poet and a violinist. So if I can request Sushmita Pathi to give a presentation to set the discussion going.
Thank you all for coming. I'm quite overwhelmed to see that so many of you have turned up for this event. It's heartening to see that there are enough people in the city who don't have a life just like me. But yeah, jokes apart, a lot of many thanks for coming today. So today I'm going to talk about my book, Properties of Rent, that started off as my PhD thesis way back in 2011. Like all PhD students who are starting out, I had very little clue as to what this work would possibly entail. And like all projects, this work also began from a hunch, a gut feeling. Mine also emerged from somewhere similar. I was always interested in cities and their built forms. My MPhil dissertation, a degree that doesn't, it's been taken away, looked at why Delhi's buildings and roads were a particular way. What did it have to do with the fact that Delhi was indeed the capital of a post-colonial nation? What kind of built forms came up in Delhi's post-liberalization phase, and what do they mean for Delhi's political life? My question really was, why does Delhi look the way it is? And why does it have a particular aesthetic? And what does politics have to do with it? It is with these partial answers to these questions that I began to look for a PhD topic. I was drawn to not just look at built forms as buildings, but more broadly as urban forms within cities, which do not quite resemble cityness. I was in many ways stuck to the same question that I had began with. Why do cities look a particular way? And what about parts of the city that don't quite look like the city? If the difference merely visual or aesthetic, or is there something else to it? Increasingly, our cities have become patchworks of neighborhoods, areas that don't quite look like the city. And the assumption is that, well, these transitions are organic and coincidental. There is probably nothing more to it. But as a political scientist, one of the first core lessons we learn is that nothing in this world is a coincidence, that there is a reason, a deeply political one, even when we are looking at innocuous things like the visual order of a city. And here I was drawn towards the form of the urban village. I wanted to study how villages become integrated into the city. Urban villages are practically villages that used to be outside the city's precinct, Delhi's precincts, until the 1950s. These are mostly Jat or Gujjar dominated villages. But the need for rapid development of Delhi post partition and post independence led to this policy of land acquisition on the southern side of Delhi. And this policy was a curious one. Instead of usual land acquisitions, which displaces countless people, this one acquired only the agricultural land of these villages and left behind residential village land. As a result, these villages, over 50 odd years, now are at the heart of bustling real estate in Delhi. So, if you just notice this map that I've put up, you see that there are very important markers of the city, the airport, the big hotels like Hyatt Regency and Moray Sheraton. There is Connaught Place on that side, and all these villages that you see, which is Dhulsiras, Dwarka, Ambrahi, Mahipalpur, Rajokri, Andheria Mode. These are all villages which constitute the new geography of the city that expanded, especially post 1950s. This brought me to the central problem of the book. What is the place of villages in our cities? What is this neat divide that we imagine between village and cities? That so neatly divides itself in academics as rural studies or agrarian studies and urban studies. The urban village may be a peculiar form in Delhi, but the phenomenon of villages giving way to cities is not a unique experience. In fact, most cities, as they are expanding, are giving way to similar kinds of rural urban intermeshings. As a result, this work undid some of my own imaginations of my method. As an urban studies scholar, I never imagined that I would need to understand rural agrarian land relations and how they may have transformed into cities. I never imagined that I would begin to see Delhi not as a continuum of neighborhoods across East and West Delhi, North and South Delhi, but rather as a continuum of villages and how that changes the entire outlook towards the city. These villages forced me to look to see Delhi as a region, not as of NCR, which is National Capital Region of Delhi, Gurgaon, Noida, but rather Delhi as an extension of a broader rural sociability that extends all the way up to Haryana and Western Uttar Pradesh. The moment we begin to see Delhi through its villages, one begins to see a city's life and career differently. And just by looking at Delhi, not through the lens of the city, but through its villages, allowed me to see what bigger role rent possibly plays in the making of its city. So, when I began studying these villages, I was more curious about how kinship networks in two villages continue to shape and negotiate property regimes in city spaces. How families, which historically hold some kind of property, begin to profit out of land's increasing value when it becomes real estate. Given that most of these villages I looked at were Jar dominated villages, the unique journey from being landowners in colonial India paved the way for them being property owners in post liberalization Delhi. As an agrarian caste, also designated as a martial race by the British, their access to both land and government jobs in 1950s and 60s is crucial to this story. While their dominance over land in Delhi and around made sure that they profited once land's value went up, their access to army jobs also gave them access to licenses and permits to sell commodities like cement and coal. In short, commodities that were strictly under Essential Commodities Act during the license permit Raj as retirement benefits. These villages, which were now in the middle of the city, also therefore continued to persist in the shadows of the city through these kinds of networks. As the agricultural land was gone by early 1950s, these villages were left to fend for themselves with the compensation money. Quite organically, the money got plugged back into the opportunities that the city threw up. They grew in the shadows of the Delhi's master plan, which turned a blind eye towards these villages because the plan had bigger projects in mind. Away from the regulatory eyes of the state, once the economy opened up in the 1990s, and the manufacturing sector gave way to service economy, these villages rapidly transformed to make way for rental housing for the new migrant workers. The ones who worked in BPOs, in new malls, and the new shopping complexes that were coming up pretty rapidly in the city. These new migrants were looking for cheap housing in expensive urban Delhi localities. Sensing on this demand as an opportunity, these villages rapidly broke down their older homes to create cheaply built buildings with scores of what is called in Delhi one room sets. So it's a room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and all of this is very neatly compact kind of architectural designs. As a result, between 1990s and 2000s, these villages underwent rapid transition where most residents broke down their older houses to accommodate this new migrant class. Over a period of years, the villages therefore emerged as owners of this rare resource in the city, that is affordable housing. And their kinship networks, panchayat structures, began to emerge as platforms for managing and setting prices for these one room sets. And given that these villages were supposedly exempt from building bylaws because they predated the plan, so according to a government circular, these villages were not subject to building bylaws, right? Um, so, given that they were exempt from building bylaws, people built the houses to grab as much space as they could, leading to extremely narrow lanes that stay dark all day and buildings that are built with the intention of maximizing as many rooms as possible and not necessarily some architectural plan. These one room sets are available uh, for anywhere between rupees 5,000 rupees to 8,000 rupees per month. Electricity is charged at a flat rate of rupees 8 or 9 rupees per unit, and which is way higher than the regular electricity charges. Even when electricity was made free by the Kejriwal government, they continued to pay electricity at the same rate. In the absence of formal rent agreements, evictions could become extremely arbitrary. All this could be possible because affordable housing in Delhi and probably in most cities is a rare commodity. And therefore, it operates in a seller's market where the sellers are already part of a thick caste and kinship networks. And this is where I argue that it's the panchayats and family units like the kunbas which emerge as cartel like formations, which begin to then govern what rents would be charged, what kind of electricity rates would be charged. Though rent is the title of the book, rent is not where I began. I was interested in studying political economy ground up through the space like that of an urban village. But I thought I was operating on the question of capital and community. But as I did my fieldwork, it became clear that these villages are not a part of the story of capital. They do not quite treat the village land that they have continued to live on as a source of income, that they can buy and sell quickly. Their collective ownership of the village land in the middle of the city is the source of their strength and their collective bargaining power within the city. These villages, now in the middle of expensive real estate, have given way to a particular kind of rental market. Since these villages have existed prior to the modern plan, they were, like I said, they were exempt from this building bylaws. So, which is precisely what allowed this emergence of an easy space which could be built in whichever way they wanted. While most broke down their houses to make spaces for migrants who were looking for cheap housing, many villages also gave way to different kinds of rental markets. Ghitorni, closer to Gurgaon, rents out go downs. Mahipalpur, close to the airport, is home to scores of cheap hotels, And Yusuf Sarai, close to All India Institute of Medical Sciences, has given way to quasi long term rental housing targeted for outstation patients who come to AIMS for long term treatment. But having said that, so this is one of the markets that have cropped up in these places. But having said that, rent, I soon realized, is much more than just what the payments landlords expect at the end of the month. Rent was also a political economic category that emerges from tight knit kinships and ownerships. You need to own something, preferably something valuable, in order to earn rent collectively. It could be oil if you were a Gulf country, but you could also be a software company which owns a valuable software that it allows people to use for a fee. But rent, as I was doing my field work, also manifested itself differently as a social relation. It was clear that the villages saw their relationship with each other differently, precisely because they understood that their economic strength comes from owning that village land together, one that is now good real estate value. But as confident as they were of their ownership of land, this knowledge was also plagued by the fact that it's constantly under threat from the city, the force of capital which always threatens to break the community apart. This becomes all the more clear when we look at the kind of migrants that start coming into the city. Just like Bangalore, Delhi's service economy boom witnessed a huge influx of migrants from the northeast into the city. The rise of globalized service industry created a massive demand for jobs that required the performance of emotional and immaterial labor, which was mostly gendered. Women from the northeastern parts of the country are in great demand as part of this globalized laboring class. They're sought after in the labor market because of their appearance, which is fetishized in the global economy, their ability to speak fluent English, as well as their comfort with Western attire. The same look and bodily comportment that gets them decent jobs in the neoliberal market renders them susceptible to perceptions of being immoral and fast in the city. Sometimes garbed as humor, at other times as affront, the intensity of the violence of these women face varies. In the case of these urban villages, this contradiction takes the shape of the Northeast tenants becoming coveted tenants because of their ability to pay higher rents, even as their cultural and ethnic differences mark their body as polluting. The profound experience of racism and discrimination takes place when it comes to housing. As most migrants find housing in these urban villages, it becomes essential to see how discrimination of the racial other and anxiety around the body of the pure self gets constituted spatially. Most cities have developed elaborate systems of exclusion. Gated communities, homogeneous neighborhoods have normalized the hierarchies between insider and the outsider, residents and the alleged trespasser. In the case of the urban villages of Delhi, these hierarchies need to be reproduced in a situation where everyone leaks cheek by jowl with one another. Because it is if the migrants have nowhere else to go, but these one room sets in urban villages, the landlords too have no other means of sustenance but rent out to precisely the same set of people who they consider suspect. Unlike in the city outside, here hierarchies are not maintained by denying housing to people from suspect communities because the other is also the source of income. But precisely the fact that the Northeast migrants are the other, the fact that they are vulnerable in the city, makes it easier to extract higher rents from them. African and Northeast migrants pay a racial surcharge over the rent. The story of rent is therefore not subsumed by control of these resources alone. It is also a matter of compulsion that the community has to rent out their property, and that too to people whom they perceive as polluting their society. They suffer from the guilt of having sold out and feel anxious about losing any remaining engagement with their culture. The feeling of being persecuted by city dwellers and the state only heightens their sense of injury. Local youth groups have cropped up a dime a dozen in these villages. Some work for cleanliness, most work for anything under the sun. In one of my villages that I studied, a new organization called Youth Brigade was floated under around 2013 by a young man. Its main agenda was to address the local concerns of the lack of unity and brotherhood within the community or village in contemporary times. Initially, it was most concerned with raising local issues that affected the village and sought them out collectively. The association was initially a response to this parable of insecurity that leads to Jats being scattered and fighting with each other in the face of an impending social crisis which threatens their existence. These pamphlets allude to uh, dangers posed by the state and the tenants. Another NGO called the Adhikar Darshan Manch, which is the one that you see here, um, wished to take up the issue of landlords' rights in response to the unruly tenants. Its first campaign was an initiative around police verification of tenants. The pamphlet distributed to create awareness about this listed the rights of landlords. It opened with a fairly provocative line: Kirayedar rakh rahe hain ya pangebaz? Are you keeping a tenant or a troublemaker? By 2018, a new vigilante group had formed in the same village, which wanted to take up matters in their own hands by keeping streets safe from troublemakers who diligently put up the videos of their nightly excursions of raiding shops owned by Northeast migrants, stopping them in their way, and checking their bags. And they would diligently put these videos all on YouTube. Rent goes on to define their social structures, their anxieties, their aspirations, and even their built forms. The architecture here is not that of fear as much as it is of mistrust that necessitates the surveillance of tenants. The perpetuation of a strong community that exhibits its dominance and re embeds security in the architecture of these villages does not necessarily slow down the process of accumulation, but instead enhances it. The culture of fear and threat of being evicted has normalized sudden hikes in rent, increased electricity bills, and so on. Thus, the already existing feelings of racism and hierarchy reinforce the process of accumulation. Indeed, the fear of violence and caste domination and the process of accumulation are not antagonistic to each other. So, now coming to the few final thoughts about rent and my method. My intellectual project was driven towards theorizing from Global South. Most of the work that emerges from scholars based in the Global South are seen as good, diligent case studies that illuminate the theories emerging from the Global North. I believe that by situating myself in these villages of a southern city, I have been able to theorize the city in ways that cannot be done through abstracted concepts that emerge from the north. In attempting to see these spaces that exist within the contradictions of the city and the village, they tell us of property and ownership that goes much beyond the urban village itself. Most of our cities are today faced with a similar force, where villages are giving way to the city. But what are the terms and conditions of that transition? What is the nature of the suburbanization that we see underway? If they are not a neat process, then probably we have many, many more spaces across our cities that resemble the urban village. But then, rent is not just about interstitial spaces. Once we see how rent shapes these villages, it is hopefully not too far fetched to see how rent also shapes most of our housing in cities where there is little regulation in general. Most of our cities resemble the story of the Jat villages in one way or the other. There are reasons why non vegetarians do not find housing in Malleshwaram, or single women do not find housing in Mumbai, and Muslims don't find housing almost anywhere. If housing continues to be a valued possession that few have controlled over, then the nature of violence also looks different. But what is the broad political stake in this project? The housing question in India has for long been looked at as a policy problem. It is eventually, and this is my argument, it's a political problem. When we see things as plainly a policy issue, it has a tendency of being overtly dominated by white papers, recommendations, draft policies, and such. What it does is that it dilutes the core question of housing being a question of inequality, access, and a complex nature in which violence works. and makes it appear somewhat untethered from its political life. So going back to the politics question that I raised, that we all are taught in our undergraduate classrooms, that there is nothing which is apolitical, right? So if how do we bring back the question of politics back into the question of policy, and then what are the possible ways then in which we could do that? So with on that note, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience.
I'll now invite our panelist, Professor Carol Upadhyay, for her set of brief comments. This evening will proceed just like this. The two panelists, Matthew Nicola and Professor Carol Upadhyay, will present their brief comments first. Sushmita will come back and as a rejoinder post some more comments on her behalf. Then there'll be another set of comments from the two panelists. At the end, there might be if we have time, there'll be a freewheeling conversation between the three of them. I might say something right at the end, and we'll keep 30 minutes for Q&A with the audience right at the very end. So please be patient and have a great evening. Professor Carol Upadhyay, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks to Sushmita for inviting me and to the BIC. Excuse my voice. I have read the book, and it's really it's really a good read, even for those of you who are not academics and not even necessarily interested in cities. It's very lively, and it really captures a lot of our everyday experiences of living in Indian cities in a way that, goes beneath the surface of everyday things that we all see and hear all the time. But I'm speaking from the position of an urban studies scholar, an urban anthropologist. And so I wanted to draw some connections between what Sushmita has done in the book and some of the wider debates and discussions that are going on in this arena at the moment. One could argue or say that over the last 1 or 2 decades, really there have been two main themes of urban studies scholars looking at Indian cities. One is the very dramatic transformations we've seen in the major metro cities like Delhi and Bangalore, because of the growth of these of high-end real estate projects, new infrastructure investments, the mushrooming of the software parks and the malls and so on, which Sushmita mentioned, and a lot of discussion and research on what has been the impact of these developments on the people who live in the cities. And the second has been on the marginalization and displacement of informal settlements, which has also been intensifying as land values have increased and land has become much more in demand because of this kind of real estate led development. But what I find is missing in a lot of the research is actually these in-between spaces, which are, one example of which are the urban villages that she writes about. But more broadly, the kind of very ordinary working class, lower middle class, and even middle class neighborhoods and colonies that we're all very familiar with, and yet really have not drawn the attention of most urban scholars. And yet what we have found in our work in Bangalore, and you will see also in Kolkata, Delhi, everywhere, that these neighborhoods also have been undergoing really rapid changes. And it's, again, visible to all of us, and probably in our own neighborhoods, where, what were earlier colonies of small or medium-sized independent bungalows have given way to these, small kind of apartment blocks, 3 or 4 floor multi-story buildings, which are coming up precisely to provide rental housing, which is what Sushmita talks about in her book. So it's happening all across the city in all kinds of neighborhoods, and all kinds of people are getting into this business of putting up rental housing from across different social classes. And it is, of course, also happening in peri-urban villages, which is what she talks about in Delhi. But even if you go to any village on the outskirts of Bangalore, or even villages that have now been more absorbed into the city, you find exactly the same phenomenon, right? That landowners who used to be farmers and can no longer make a living from agriculture put up small buildings. They put up PGs for students, hostels, or various kinds of rental units. So this is a phenomenon we see across, and yet somehow it has escaped the attention of researchers as well as policymakers. And as Sushmita said, it's somehow there's an approach to the question of housing, urban housing in India, that seems very, very kind of staid and stuck in a kind of master planning mode, where they imagine that housing has to be created for the purpose of ownership. And yet the main demand is housing for rent, right? Because the cities' populations are highly mobile. As in Delhi and Bangalore, we have this huge influx of migrants coming in to work in the service economy across different income levels, different social class, regional backgrounds. And all of these people require housing. Who is providing the housing? It's exactly the kind of people that she writes about in this book, and various other kinds of people in different kinds of neighborhoods. So my point is that the book really fills an important gap in the scholarship, and there's much more to be done along these lines to think about how the rising demand for rental housing, as well as the increasing provision of rental housing by various kinds of small homeowners, small landowners, etc., is actually reshaping the city in ways that are completely, kind of not thought about, not mapped, and not understood. And as I think Prem said in the beginning, completely outside the ambit of what we imagine is the master planning process, right? Where the planning process doesn't even really take into account the kind of quotidian, everyday ways in which housing, buildings, construction, et cetera, happen. So the urban villages of Delhi, I would say, are probably even an extreme case of this, because they are shaped by their peculiar history, the way in which they were kind of unmapped or marked out from the administrative structure of the municipality of the city. And so we're kind of left to their own devices to grow in certain ways, to take advantage of the economic opportunities which were there. But it is just one case of many others that one could look at and one has to think about to understand what's happening. And as Prem said, how our cities are functioning. And there's a second theme that I wanted to mention here that comes out very strongly in the book, which is that it resonates with an emerging body of work that has been referred to as agrarian urbanization, which looks precisely at the question of if we do away with our traditional rural-urban kind of dichotomy that we all kind of think is common sense for understanding both the rural and the urban, of course. If you just look at it practically, we realize that most cities, Bangalore, Delhi, all the cities have actually, grown and urbanized by swallowing up the rural areas and the villages all around them. And yet, again, this is a process that has not been paid sufficient attention. At the same time, we know that the land, if you just go into, hundreds of villages around Bangalore where their land has, been turned into real estate, basically. What are the processes through which this happens, number one? And number two, what does it mean in terms of the city itself? It is not that villages just get wiped out. In the case of Delhi, of course, these villages were allowed to exist for kind of political and administrative reasons. But even in Bangalore, it's the same. Most of the neighborhoods you see in Bangalore were once upon a time villages. And you can see it very clearly when you drive through them, from the place names, from the way the roads are, and so on. I think this is an old theme of sociologists that, cities in India are made of villages, but we haven't really dug down deep enough into trying to understand what does that mean for urban life, for the shape of the city, for questions of governance, for questions of urban politics, for housing, and so on and so forth. And so we now have just, the emergence of some studies which are looking particularly at peri-urban areas and trying to ask these questions to understand how, the pre-existing, one could say, agrarian or rural social structure, the agrarian structure, the mode in which livelihoods and land were held and unfold, how they have now been transposed into new kinds of urban property, urban livelihoods, and so on. And again, it's precisely the kind of process that she flags that we see in all these villages, as I just mentioned, where land becomes real estate, but it doesn't just pass out of the hands of farmers. They themselves become small landlords very often, and they invest in various kinds of rental housing and so on. So, my time is up? Okay, so I have a few more, sorry? Okay, no, I thought I would just raise one more. Maybe we'll take Matthew's comments and her response and come back. I wanted to raise a couple of kind of broader questions about, the idea of rent itself, the category of rent, and the way in which you have talked about rent in the book. But maybe just one final comment here is that the analysis that Sushmita has in the book of how these small-scale rental economies function in these urban villages reminds us, as something we should all know, is that when you look at what we call informal economies or informal housing or informal settlements, we imagine that there's something, that they're somehow outside of the ambit of that they kind of are not organized in some way, and yet they are highly organized, right? They're just not organized in the ways in which kind of mainstream economic or corporate thinking would imagine cities should be organized. And she shows very clearly how, in these contexts, it is relations of caste and kinship that really step in and organize these markets. And again, this is something we see across the city. And normally, a lot of this stuff gets just plunked into the barrel of informality, and it's just like this black box. And there's the organized economy, organized urban development, and there's the rest of it. And yet we see that, these are very complex systems that also, provide certain kinds of opportunities to the people who are involved, as well as certain kinds of exclusions. So I think there's much more, that we need to do to really understand how these housing and these new rental economies are working. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor. Matthew Adikula, do you want to take about 5 to 7 minutes?
Sure. Firstly, thanks to BIC and thanks to Sushmita for the book and for having me here. It's indeed an honor to be part of a panel discussion of such a wonderful book. Before I get into specific aspects of the book, I just wanted to sort of highlight, what makes this book unique and why all of you should buy it. So, firstly, let me just say that this book is absolutely well written. I mean, the craft of writing, honestly, when you read it, it's like a piece of literature and not just and sort of an academic sort of treatise. And in many ways, the book reminded me of literary or narrative nonfiction, genre of writing, which I'm personally a big fan of. Say Aman Sethi's Free Man, Catherine Bruce, Behind Beautiful Forevers, Snigdha Poonam's Dreamers. All of these are great narrative nonfiction, not academic books, but this book, the way the craft of writing is such that it parts of it actually has that resonance. I feel, and that makes it, pretty much an interesting and an engaging read for everyone. I would say, even beyond the academics in the room. So that's one. I think that's what really captured. I mean, sort of caught my attention. A couple of other things also just to highlight. One is in terms of the ability of the book to capture the complexities, the nuances, the idiosyncrasies of the village as it is, seeing the processes as it is, without just being caught up in the totalizing narrative of neoliberalism, which a lot of us are often guilty of being while we describe social processes. And at the same time, keeping a critical eye, to capture some of those trends, the relationships that are there. So the small political economy outlook, that frame allows you to enter that space and capture certain realities, but at the same time, you're able to engage with larger theoretical debates on capital and rent in a way that it's not forced. And I feel that balance is the other thing that's really struck out and works really well, as anyone who's interested in understanding these processes. And I think thirdly, it's a treatment of the subjects. I found it very sensitive, in terms of how the various unique characters that are there in the villages, right? You're empathetic to, and not sort of prejudiced and judgmental while you look at them, but at the same time, you're able to unpack and lay before the reader the problematic nature in the way some of the landlords operate in a non-preachy manner, not in the sort of, American PK kind of, mode, just as an aside, so I think that sort of works as a book. And I felt, these are reasons why this book really, worked well for me as just as a reader, forget about being, working in space of urban governance and policy. Just I wanted to speak about a couple of specific aspects of the book as someone who looks into questions of law and governance in the city. I just speak about a couple of them. So one is about urban villages as a space of exception, and that is what we see in the book. And when we see when you speak about exception, we are actually noticing that much of the city actually operates through spaces of exception. In that way, the village exception is not an exception of that sort, but still it has particular, because the urban villages sort of idea is not the ones at least captured here, not the same kinds of peri-urban village context that we might see. But just to be very quick on the nature of this exception and how they operate. One is the master plan from 1963 has formally made it, excluded these villages. So they operate outside the plan. Much of our spaces exist within the plan, but still operate outside it in other ways. But they formally operate outside the plan since 1963. There's been a change in 2011, but they formally exist outside the plan. And the question that I have is, in terms of how the villages in some ways have been able to use that exception and thrive in its own way when it's outside the realms of the state and the planning sort of system, right? So at one level, there's a sense of betrayal. There's a sense of betrayal by the villages that a lot of their needs are not being met, and infrastructure is poor and services are poor. But at another level, they don't want to be seen by the state. They want to be outside the realm. And the question is, now that the state wants to come back to regulate the villages, there is a pushback by the villagers against that move. Now, it sort of raises the question of, if that's the case, and this, by the way, is slightly different from how other urban, settlements, other urban categories sort of deal with the state. Unauthorized colonies, by the way, are very keen to be regularized. Slums are also keen to be regularized. Whereas urban villages here, at least the cases that Sushmita is speaking about, don't want to be regularized. So one is, I want to hear more from her about what are the reasons why of this disjuncture, right? What are the reasons for it, and what does it say about the nature of law and planning in the city? So that was one sort of key takeaway. The other point that I really wanted to sort of, again caught my attention is the discussion about informal institutions that operate in these spaces. So we have various informal institutions that operate. The urban villages have been orphaned. Very clearly, they've been orphaned by the state. And when it is orphaned, there is a bunch of informal institutions like the panchayat and the kunbas, emerging. Now, the panchayat as a cartel and the kunba as a joint stock company, I found those characterizations very interesting. You can possibly expand on it, but I just wanted to check about, and by the way, these panchayats, and the panchayats are neither the cup panchayats of Haryana, nor are they the panchayats of the 73rd Amendment type of panchayat. It's a different form of panchayat. So, and these panchayats also become RWAs. They also try, and even the kunbas in case of one of the villages also operate as RWAs. So one is to understand this sort of very tricky nature of how they operate, and why is it that these institutions come into being? Does it show? Is it an indication of the failure of formal representative institutions? The attempt to have local government institutions with representatives, 73rd, 74th Amendment, having local governments. Is it a failure of that? Why do they emerge? These are also questions that sort of struck me while I read the book. But there are more questions I can ask possibly in the next round, but for now I'll just stop. I found the book absolutely interesting. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Sushmita, do you want to take about 10 minutes?
Yes. So thank you both, Carol and Matthew, for this fantastic comments. Closer? Okay. Is this better? Okay. So I'll try to sort of respond to both of your questions because there's some common strands across both of in both your questions. The first, I'll start with the whole thing about exactly what you said, that these our urbanization increasingly is looking like some kind of an extension of as in the villages and these cities are slowly coming together in way as our suburbanization is sort of taking place. And so here what I did was I tried to look at the city, the village itself as a region, and and Delhi itself as a region which is constituted by villages. And what it does is that, and what it brought in was this lens of the way in which historically these villages were constituted. And here, the interesting term that came to me as I was going through archives and such was the term of bhaichara. Now, bhaichara is interestingly a form of land revenue system. It's a way in which, like zamindari exists in West Bengal and Bihar and the eastern parts of the country. The northwest part of the country, which is Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and Delhi, were governed by something called bhaichara, which is some kind of a common ownership of property, of village lands. So this is where you have common lands. This is where you have some shared kind of belonging of land, which is recognized by the British. So what happens is that it is this kind of bhaichara kind of understanding of ownership of land, which gives way into the urban form of land organization. So as these villages uh, become integrated, bhaichara does not remain simply a land tenure system, but what it becomes is also a form of ethos which governs that the Jat community by and large. Right? So here, this bhaichara form, which inculcates a certain kind of equality, which inculcates a certain kind of equal membership of everyone, gives rise to a particular kind of organization itself. And this, in the northwest part of Delhi, it extends all the way up to what we understand as Khap Panchayats. It has a different kind of life in Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, and they're infamous for honor killings and such. But in Delhi, they have a different kind of a life. And but it's an extension of the same structure of Khap Panchayats, which is governed by this unique sense of membership of the Jat Biradari, right? Biradari is a term for the community. And it's the entire northwest part of India is then divided into an entire is a three-tier Khap Panchayat system, which includes, and the Delhi bit is called Palam 360, which Palam 360. So it's a conglomerate of 360 villages which form the Delhi Khap Panchayat. But then the Delhi Khap Panchayat, again, because it's coming to the urban fray, they have different concerns than their rural counterparts. They operate very differently. So, which is why, because they in a way want to resist government attention, states' attention, but in a way they also cannot simply exist as unrecognized bodies entirely, which is why part of them also functions as RWAs. So there are several village panchayats which have gone and organized themselves and registered themselves as the Resident Welfare Association, which is a recognized kind of a body in urban politics. But this is where these panchayats at the village end, they continue to function as, let's say, central organizing committees of cartels. All cartels would need a certain kind of a platform which organizes that rent, right? So OPEC functions because it's precisely the kind of a body which controls the cartel, right? So here, if you watch Breaking Bad and other kinds of shows, you would know exactly how the drug cartels work. There's a certain kind, there are set number of people who organize that kind of rent. So here, precisely, these panchayats become those bodies which become those platforms of negotiation of what's the rent going to be. But ultimately, it's an expression of collectivity. Rent cannot exist unless there is a certain understanding of collective ownership. And that's what's the most important point here. About the question of writing, thanks for those wonderful comments. I'm glad you like the reading, the writing bit of it. It took a while to get it right. But I think my fundamental struggle was the fact that I was focusing on landlords alone. While researching, I had to take this call whether I would want to bring in the perspectives of tenants as well. But then I realized if I do get into the question of tenants, then I will have to deal with another set of variables, which includes what regions they come from, what occupations do they have, their gender, their ethnicities, which would their own caste. That would lead to a different kind of a complexity, and then I would not be able to do justice to the question that I was asking, which is that of rent. So as a result, I let that question be. But what I told myself is that this work is going to be, if I'm going to write, I'm going to write from the lens of a migrant. I'm going to write from that lens of having lived in one of these spaces myself. When I was 18, when I came to college from a small town, the first place I stayed in was again one of these villages in a PG, quote unquote. I talk about that in the book. But even when I moved into university hostels, several friends continue to live in these villages. If some of you are from Delhi and have lived as tenants, I'm sure you've lived in one of these villages, because that's where students, first time entrance into the city, invariably seek housing in such spaces, because that's precisely the kind of market it's trying to address. We are a set of migrants like us, which were middle class to lower middle class, wouldn't want to live in a place like a slum, but also at the same time cannot afford upper middle class localities. So as a result, there's a huge vacuum in cities, right, which addresses this particular kind of an interstitial rental market, right, which is meant for these new urban working class labor, right? Many of them belong to the precariat working class, who are working in BPOs, who are working in spas and restaurants, who need a particular kind of a life which resembles middle class living, right? Which is one of flats, right? So that's why, so that's one thing I had to deal with, as to how do I bring in the lens of the migrants without literally bringing them in, right? Because there are very few interviews or testimonies you find in the book which actually belongs to the migrants. The other is a question of gender. I also had to deal with the fact that most of my, in fact, yeah, almost, yeah, I probably spoke to 2 women in my fieldwork. The fact that all my respondents were men who were landlords. So then how do I bring in the question of gender as well? So then those were the 2 very difficult questions, issues that I had to address, where I had to look at, where to address this question of absence of gender as well as migrants. But then how do you write about them when they are absent in your book, technically? The question of exception, how does it thrive? And the art of not being governed. And this is a James Scott reference, who talks about these upper highlands spaces in Indonesia, where it's inhabited by a nomadic community who are constantly moving from one place to another without being recognized by the state, without being seen by the state. And that's where James Scott sees this as a move of resistance, right? These are people who are resisting state by constantly moving from one place to another. This this precise the same thing happens in my field work, but not quite in the same way, right? So because these are people who are resisting being seen by the state, but at the same time, they're not unseen by capital, right? They're trying to avoid the state from coming in, but at the same time, they're deeply invested in the meshes of capital. They're constantly responding to the needs that are being thrown up by the city, by the urban capital. What does the city need? The city needs infrastructure. Who become the first contractors? It is people from these villages. What does the city need? The city needs buses and taxis. It needs public transport. Who then start running these transport businesses? It is again people from these villages. And when it comes to rental housing, it is again precisely these villagers who begin to fill, to sense an opportunity that is thrown by the city and then respond to that. So yes, they are unseen by the state, but they're very plugged in what's happening in the question of capital, so to speak. So here, which is why it leads to this interesting kind of a paradox where, and again, their own relationship to capital, their own relationship to the city is precisely governed by this contradiction. Because on one hand, they do want to be responding to capital's needs, but they don't quite want to be seen by the state, because that being seen by the state means tax. Being seen by the state means regulation. Being seen by the state means another competing authority, which is a challenge to their own sense of organization that they've built over 50 years, over 60 years, which is governed by panchayats and that of kunbas. So coming to the question of kunbas and the panchayat as well, the panchayat, like I said, is precisely this kind of a formation which become the centralizing committee of cartels, of the housing cartel here, where everyone more or less has the same kind of rental housing to have an offer. Nobody has, you could very well be taking up anyone's property, doesn't matter, because they all look the same, they all have similar kinds of problems. So then how do you govern a kind of a market which is of similar commodity, which is the same commodity, right? When it comes to the Kunba, it's again an interesting kind of, as a joint stock company, it's an interesting kind of formation, because these are family units which together decide that there is incentive in gentrifying their stretch of property. So because these are village lands, what happens is that people from the same family, they tend to own properties in the same area, in the same lane, or in the same part of the village. So as a result, when they realize that, okay, there is a particular kind of a market to which needs a certain kind of gentrified rental property, what they do is that as family members, they begin to pull in money to upgrade that space. So, say a kunba could be a family unit of, say, 3 generations. So where cousins, uncles are together, and sometimes kunbas can have up around 100 to even 120 stakeholders who come in and pull in money to, say, put paved stones on their streets, or to, say, have beautiful lighting on their streets, so that a certain kind of a clientele which is looking for a specific kind of an aesthetized property, especially, and this is mainly for commercial property, they are they are willing to pay higher rents for those gentrified pockets in the village. So this is why it functions, and this is why I'm calling it a joint stock company, because there are equal stakeholders in that project who are pooling equal kinds of money. But then it's vernacular, it is governed by rent, because regular joint stock companies are composed of amorphous, anonymous people who are quickly selling and buying stocks and shares. Mostly companies don't care about who are the people who are buying their stocks and shares, and that keeps changing probably at an hourly basis on right in stock markets. But when you look at these vernacular forms of joint stock companies and kunbas, you see how families are very clear about who becomes a part of that joint stock company and strictly maintain who can come into it, right? They wouldn't allow just anybody to become a part of that structure. Yeah. And then the question of failure of the state. Well, as in what happens in the way I talk about it in the book is the way in which state completely forgets them, right? That these spaces are coming up in the almost the absence of these states. So I talk about them in the book as having come up in the shadows of the city or the shadows of the master plan. The master plan of Delhi at this time is a regional plan. It's not just a city plan. It's wanting to govern all of NCR. It's wanting to change all of NCR. So the planners really have really big things at hand. They couldn't care less about these spaces. So as a result, this is why these spaces literally come up in the shadows of the master plan and the city. Okay, so then I'll just go. So yes, in a way, yes, it is. One could see it as a failure, and this is precisely why the state does want to come in with a different kind of a stake into the city, into these villages, and wants to tax and regulate them precisely because municipal corporations are running out of money. So there is an whole kind of a tension which is emerging out of this. So yeah, thank you.
We want to have about 30 minutes for Q&A, so I'll just give the respondents a minute each to make their brief comments.
I can skip.
Go ahead, very briefly.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, I mean, my response or many things one could reflect on all of this, but I'm interested in the way in which you're setting up, the question of how these dark landlords are engaging with capital, right? Because on the one hand, you're saying that this is precisely how they're organizing their business, their process of accumulation. On the other hand, you're saying this is not the usual story of capital in Indian cities, right? So I was just wondering if you would, maybe try to reflect at a broader level about, this idea of vernacular capitalism. And what I was thinking when I read the book also is that, well, sure, I mean, this is happening in these villages, but it's happening across the economy.
Right.
Right, and in the corporate sector as well. There are a lot of things that are organized outside of the kind of formal structure of the corporation and company, and how business happens in India. So that's just a kind of a broader comment, maybe not a question.
Matthew?
Yeah, again, just keeping very short. I mean, even if you look at in Bangalore, just to try to sort of relate with with the city we are in, there are efforts to regularize, informalities, and then there are people who want it to be regularized in some ways, and there are forms of resistance to it. And in your book, you allude to and even in terms of if you look at the outskirts, the village outskirts in Bangalore specifically, some of the spaces that I've looked at in the electronic city area and stuff like that, there's a clear resistance by the village panchayats to be incorporated into the city, right? And you see that all the time. But here, what I found interesting in the cases you're mentioning is also about the efforts to regularize by the state itself, and at one level, the state being happy to regularize, but also not keen on demolition, possibly.
Yeah.
And this is when, I mean, now that the things, if you look at what's been happening, in India, with the bulldozer Raj sort of emerging, I just wanted to get a sense, maybe you can respond later, to what extent are these spaces, how precarious are spaces like this? Are those community linkages and social capital that these jats organize, do they have relations that allow them to resist it in some ways? Or are all of them, in the realm of precarity that anything can happen anytime? So yeah, thanks.
We'll open the floor to questions. Please raise your hand.
I think that we come here.
Oh, okay. Oh, they have to come here. Whoever wants to ask a question or make a comment, please come up.
First come, first serve.
First come, first serve. You can. Yes, please, sir.
I was thinking, yeah. I was thinking about Matthew's comment that these villages in Delhi are not wanting integration into the master plan, whereas the slum and unregulated layout in Bangalore does.
They want to be regularized, not to be under the.
Yeah, but I think that is it a more complex relationship where at a very primordial level they want to be recognized as existing. At least the Delhi villages are recognized, their existence is acknowledged by the master plan. Whereas if you look at the Bangalore master plan, it pretends as though these slums and unregulated layouts don't exist, even though they might house half the city's population. But the other aspect is the integration into markets that are shaped by the master plan. And there it's more complex. There's definitely a desire to get the economic opportunity for careers. But I think hesitation on land markets, given that their land markets in India are very inefficient, riddled with bureaucracy, opacity, corruption, and of course the elephant in the room, which is the link between urban land and political fundraising. And therefore, the prices are distorted and have no relationship to median incomes. So actually the poor have survived in the Indian city because of these spaces outside master planning, which gives them the informal systems of tenure. So it's is it a sort of very complex sort of relationship with the official plan where they want a part of it, but they're very particular about keep the land market part of it out?
In the interest of time, shall we collect 3-4 questions and then you can respond?
Yeah.
Yes, please, sir. Please, sir.
Speaking about master plan, you've been saying these villages are outside the scope of the master plan. But it is bound to be so, because a master plan has a certain jurisdiction. So it is, for instance, in Bangalore, it is prepared by the BDA, Bangalore Development. So it has what is called its own planning area. And many villages, etc., and urbanizing areas are outside. They are bound to be. Even if you expand, go on expanding, there will always be some villages, some non-urban areas, which will be outside the scope of the master plan. So that cannot be handled. I don't know, for instance, Delhi, you said now they have a regional plan. I don't know what's the area of the regional plan, because you also have an NCR, which is much, much bigger. Is this, for instance, the regional plan of Delhi, I would like to know, larger than the master plan prepared earlier, and what would be the jurisdiction, how do things operate there beyond the master plan? There's a really complex relationship to this. Yeah, and that is one. And secondly, just one question on the information we get relating to rental housing. I don't know, for instance, whether it's in Bangalore or Delhi. What is the share of rental housing? You also spoke about the demand for rental housing. Is it really going up, or it is declining? And what is the scope that to differentiate between the rental housing needs of the poor, especially migrants and all on the one side, and those who are settled the middle class and the others, for instance, even the middle classes who own houses in central area, they are happy to rent it out, get a bad rent and move to. Very well, they have this gated community, better villages, and so on and so forth. So the rental housing market and the share of different sectors, if you can probably enlighten.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm drawn to this talk mainly because of the fact that it is something that I care very deeply about. I am pretty much a landlord and I have a lot of rental houses. So I have a couple of very interesting comments on this because I do have rental accommodation. I started with commercial industrial for the last 7 years and now predominantly just going all out into residential because of the kind of statistics and the numbers that I have, which is for 45 crores Indians in 1960 and in 60 years is 130, which is literally 3 times. So I think that answers your question on the demand of housing. 60% of India, of Bangalore is migrants, typically majority from Tamil Nadu. And India is urbanizing right now is at 30%, the world's at 55, and we'll be going to 45%. Hence, 2 years back, I started the company which I currently run, which is an architectural studio and a modular housing company which predominantly builds factory-built houses. Right. So I have a couple of very interesting solutions because as an entrepreneur, we talk not ask questions, actually answer those questions. So I was just thinking.
Good, we have someone who's answering questions.
I was just thinking, what would be how I have actually 4, but I don't want to act like a panel, so I'll probably just keep up to one interesting one. Obviously, in the states where I model most of my business from, they have very regularized rental housing tolerances. Obviously, if someone's house is slightly better than the one, so they have slight tolerances, and the fact how modular housing could probably benefit these specific urban developments because it can be moved after a certain time because today's problem is today's problem. Even in 20 years, I don't think we're going to solve today's problem. We're going to have to solve a much bigger problem that time. So that time we should be able to move the units, right? And obviously build according to code. So I just have that as a solution to all this.
Thanks. May I ask a question? Sure. Two related questions. How do you see the question of value? And I mean, you did talk about what is it called, gentrification of the Shapurjat or that kind of place in a bit. But these are people who are responding basically not to the analytic of rent, to the appreciation of value, right, in their environs. And how do you then see value in your larger theoretical agenda? Two, the question of gender, I think, is central to the way you presented it in the beginning. Is do you see a question of rentier masculinity here, and if so, how? So those are 4 questions from the people. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with the master plan question itself because that's probably set the context. The master plan in Delhi was a regional plan to begin with. It was framed by Ford Foundation. It was encouraged by Nehru, and in 1962. So this is where the regional idea actually comes in. That Delhi need not be planned as a city, but it needs to be planned as a region. And that's where, so if you look at, there's a lot of work done on Delhi master plan itself and the flaws of it. And the primary flaws of the master plan were 2. One is that it forgot that there are working class poor who would need housing in the city. So it only earmarked very middle class spaces for living. It entirely forgot to earmark spaces for, and decent enough spaces for the working class poor. Which is why there is a lot of literature around the fact that plans itself create slums. Plan forces people to squat in illegal housing, right? So that's one. And the second thing that it forgot was the question of manufacturing units, right? So what it did was it created manufacturing zones, but which outside the city, but eventually it didn't make sense for many of these smaller manufacturing units to function outside, which is why they all again found places in these informal spaces like the urban village, so to speak, where both migrant workers as well as manufacturing units found space together. About the question of being left, that master plan is not supposed to be comprised of everything, but what's happening here is that the space right outside the village is one that is a product of Delhi master plan. But whereas one that is inside, which is the village itself, that's been left out. The question on the question on your question about possible solutions. That's probably something to look at. But there is some interesting work coming up on how the kind of things that we're talking about, which is on Airbnbs, and how Airbnbs which is precisely looking at this kind of gradations of rental property, and how that is changing the nature of rental markets in cities of global north, in places like Paris and London and so on and so forth, and how it is making the city even more expensive for a working class population, right? Because Airbnbs automatically means that they are far more expensive than, say, your regular rental market. So when you're looking at these kind of financialized arrangements, then probably they fall into another kind of a different trap, where they will eventually become unaffordable for most people, right? The question on about whether the internal structures, about Matthew's question, and I'll sort of answer your question also together with it, which is the way in which these villages are structured, and the way in which these what's happened is that they have kept themselves isolated from the state, but that does not mean that they're isolated in all sorts of ways. They have plugged themselves into local governance. They have plugged themselves in local politics. So as much as they want to stay outside the state, they've figured out the one way to do it is by plugging themselves directly into the state. So when it's not like threats of demolitions haven't happened, haven't taken place. They have taken place. Demolitions have taken place. But eventually, what has happened is, because they have strengthened their position as local councillors, as in Delhi police, in municipal corporation of Delhi. What's happened is because their presence is so strong in local bureaucracy, they have been able to avert the question of demolition. So I talk about demolitions in the book, when demolitions look like nothing. Nobody even figured out that demolition took place, because the MCD came and they broke like one extension, which anyway didn't mean much, and then they put it down in the registers and left. So those kinds of, so unlike the kind of bulldozer Raj demolitions that we are seeing, which are eventful, which are so devastating, these demolitions literally feel like nothing. So which takes me back to the question that Carol actually asked, which is on why I'm saying this is not capital, why I'm saying this is rent. Because capital is, if you're looking at, so you're right, isn't there's a lot of literature that is especially coming out now, which is saying that rent is, all finance capital is technically rent, right? Because what is finance capital producing but softwares and some kind of resources or service, which is then controlled, and then there is a lot of literature coming on which is saying that all finance capital is rent. So therefore there is no distinction. But my contention is precisely this, that rent in the entire political economy literature has been looked at either as some kind of a mild annoyance in the path of accumulation, where landlords are constantly harassing the industrialists, right? For higher rents, which is constantly creating trouble for industrialists. But on the other hand, what this kind of literature is doing is that it's saying that rent is nothing but a faithful ally of capital, right? All it does is helps rent to just multiply it helps capital to multiply and become multifold. My contention is that yes, this rent is very, very closely knit with the question of global capital, with the kind of opportunities that are coming with urban capital. But here they still are at loggerheads with the question of capital. They still are, because they realize, because once they let the state in, and with the state, the capital will also come in, right? So they're not two separate entities. What will happen is that their own organization will become weak. And which is why I talk about this in the book, that in here, most of the investments, most of the transactions, they always take place in hard cash. They take place in hard cash because it's through hard cash that ownership and very strong notions of control can actually be maintained. If it becomes like finance capital, where capital becomes fictitious, it becomes some notional number in somewhere, then control becomes equally hard to maintain. So here, when I'm talking about the opposition to the city, where they're feeling that they are selling out of the city, or the opposition to capital, I'm saying that this is where they are. Capital and rent are sort of strange bedfellows. They are working together, but at the same time, there is some amount of uh, unhappiness about from both sides. Even from the side of the capital, there are cases when venture capitalists have thrown out uh, uh, landlords who became angel funders in someone's startup from the village, right? So they were like, "Who's this person? My landlord." They said, "If you want my funding, then you." This is VCs, venture capitalists talking. And that if you want my money, then you better get these your dormant partners out. So those kinds of, you see that there is a mutual distrust between capital and rent, which governs these spaces. Coming to your question about value, so this is where, as in my theoretical claim also is, that rent for the longest time has been understood as not producing value. Capital produces value because it's produced through labor. What does rent produce? Rent produces nothing. Rent is just resource. So it doesn't produce much. So it doesn't create value. But that, as in many people have argued the same, that rent does produce value. But I also look at the ways in which rent is producing not just economic value, but it also operates on other kinds of registers of value, which is that of a kind of social value of belongingness to the city, or their own communal sense of belonging, their notions of what is the value of the daughters that they have. So then value operates on these multiple registers, which goes beyond. So which is why I say that I'm talking about social life of rent. Rent is not just an economic thing, it has a wider social, familial repercussion, and it shapes not just these spaces, it shapes those families, it shapes those interpersonal relationships, right? Because they're constantly talking about this kind of a threat, this kind of opposition that they're facing from the city. Rentier masculinity, I do talk about masculinity. I do talk about and how it's governed by a certain kind of a masculine logic. Whether how far is rent alone able to define it is not something I'm sure of. But yeah, as in this case, one could say that this could be understood as rentier capital, rentier masculinity as well.
Thanks. Another round of questions. Yes, 2 or 3 we can take, and then we'll close. Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
Hi, I've got 2 questions. One is about these villages which are which weren't part of the master plan and are now the hotspots in the cities like Delhi or somewhere else. So are they still under the same Baichara system, or is there a need for these villages to be integrated into the new, like I'm from Bangalore, so I can talk about BBMP kind of thing. So are they still in the same old system, or is there a pressure for these villages to get integrated into such systems? That's one question. And another one is about the rental value that you spoke. It has a lot of social belonging and a lot of other values. So whose contribution is more, the landlords or the tenants for this value?
In what kind of way?
So rent as such. Your book titled as rent shaping the cities.
Right.
So rent has a value that you spoke about just now, belonging, and not like the capitalist control. Rent has some value. So who has more contribution for that value? Is it the landlord or the tenant who rent for the value that you spoke about? That's the second question.
We'll take two more and then
Yeah,
come back.
sure.
Yes, please keep it brief. We'll take these two and then she will respond and we'll
Good
close.
evening. My question is related to the regulation by the state. You said that these urban villages are averse to the state, and the state also does not take that much of importance. So, don't you feel we've reached a point where the build-up of resources and all of that, the state needs to regulate these sort of locations? And how do you suggest the state goes about doing that?
You talked a bit about gentrification, but the theories of gentrification, urbanization, and suburbanization, they have been largely focused and developed in localized settings in developed Western societies, and there haven't been any indigenous models of such theories that can be explained, like in the global South or in India in general. So, how do you think we can understand these urban phenomenon in our situation, and can the things you described about Delhi, can that be generalized to other Indian cities?
Thank you. We have 5 minutes, so do you want to, and any closing comments you might want to make to close the evening's conversation?
Sure. Yeah, so the question about how they're left out, so the thing is that when the Delhi Master Plan is made, they're not technically left out. They are. So Delhi Master Plan does mention the urban villages, and it gives this nomenclature as urban village to these spaces, but says that okay, these will remain rural in their culture, in their ways. They will be engaged in rural kinds of profession without necessarily clarifying what that meant, and how were they supposed to do that when the city is closing in so fast. So technically there is no, it's not like they're left as vacant spaces in the master plan they talked about, but there's nothing concrete said about what's going to happen to these spaces, right? So as a result, what's happening is that the the master plan itself is then governed by a different kind of a logic. What's happening in the throes of the master plan coming in, right? That these panchayats are immediately de-recognized, they formally de-recognized, but they informally continue to have a different kind of a life, right? Because they're recognized by the people in the village. So that's the way in which they continue. But at the same time, Municipal Corporation of Delhi becomes extremely important. So as panchayats are dissolved, Municipal Corporation becomes important. And that's the way in which they integrate themselves with the Municipal Corporation of Delhi and continue to fight elections and win them, and then begin to also strengthen their own position. So that's a way I would. It's a little different from the Bangalore story. It's not the same, but it's possibly because these acquisitions took place in 1950s. About your question on, I'm forgetting where, gentrification. Okay, yeah. So your question on gentrification. That's what, as in, when you look at these stories of gentrification, it is assumed, and that's what, as in, that's the theory that I'm trying to sort of move away from, is that gentrification means that these villages get completely wiped off, right? That villages automatically become cities, villages automatically lead to condominiums or these high rises, right? And villages completely disappear, they cease to exist. This is a different kind of phenomenon, and I'm seeing my argument is that this is possibly the kind of urbanization that's seen everywhere else, right? Not just Delhi. That yes, there are condominiums coming up, there are all kinds of high rises being built, there are tech parks being built, but But these villages don't quite disappear. They continue to lurk in the backdrop of these big, tall buildings. And what is it that they tell us? What is their presence telling us? What do their presence mean for our cities, right? So, which is why my emphasis is that it's not a Delhi problem. It's not a Delhi question alone. It's something that defines more and more increasingly, as someone here was pointing us to how fast urbanization is spreading. These kinds of interstitial spaces is what's going to be, they're not exceptions anymore. These will be a very predominant form of our city life, right? Spaces exactly which don't look like cities. Coming to your question on what recommendations, what could we say to the state, right? I have no idea. So we are very good at asking good questions. We don't nearly answer enough questions. I wish we could. But just to sort of take that along, I think so I also teach in the public policy program in the National Law School. And I often see that there is a similar kind of a tendency to ask as to what is the solution, what can be done about it, what could be the recommendations that could be given to the state. And that's precisely my pushback. I'm saying, are we sure we understand the problem enough, right? I think that probably there is a need to slow down. And like my students constantly get frustrated with me because I'm constantly telling them all the kinds of problems that exist, and I'm not often telling them solutions. And they're like, okay, what do we do about this? And I don't have good answers. But my only urge to them is that, are you sure we understand the problem enough? So that's what I think my submission is to this question, is that I think what policy needs to do is probably to step back a little rather than constantly think of what's the solution, what can be the policy recommendations, what can we do about it. I think we need to step back a little and ask as to, do we know the problem? Do we know what's happening here? So I think that would be the...
You said this right in the beginning when you pointed out that all the things that are political don't need to lead to policy. And I think that's where you answer that question right in the beginning. Are you done closing?
I think that
okay.
Should be...
Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful evening. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Sushmita.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for sticking around, and those were great questions.